Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar for K-5 teachers in our 2021-2022 webinar series, focusing on building student visual literacy skills. I'm Rebecca Edwards, and I'll be your host today. I'll be presenting together with my colleagues in the Getty Museum Education Department, Brittany Prieto and Darcy Beeman-Black. Today, we'll be focusing on strategies that you can use in the elementary school classroom to help students build their self-expression skills. We'll share how these approaches integrate with Common Core standards and talk about how you can use them to guide your students. We also hope to inspire you to try something new in your classroom. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and start delving into our topic. So some of you will have been along with us for the ride this year, and some of you may be just joining us for the first time. Our focus has been on visual literacy, and we've been focusing on different aspects of the visual literacy process. We've talked about how to read an image and how to help students build skills in deconstructing the information that they find in an image. We've talked about how to talk about art, how to lead discussions and dialogues in your classroom, and to feel comfortable as a teacher doing that yourself. We've also talked about how to research art. So once you've looked and read what the image said and wondered about it and talked about it, then how to go about doing some additional research to learn more. And last but not least, we're now going to be focusing on how to take those skills, those visual literacy skills, and apply them to students' own work and own self-expression. So we have over the course of the year looked at how artists express themselves and use images to communicate their own ideas and thoughts. And now it's time to turn that on students and give them a chance to use the same types of skills to express themselves. So that's what we'll be focusing on today. So creative self-expression is certainly a valuable process for your students. You likely think so if you're here today. Just very briefly, I wanted to point out some of the benefits for students. It's yet another way of learning to communicate, and it's a way to communicate, especially when students may not have the same verbal skills that they might have in other forms of self-expression. So using creative work as a way of expressing themselves is great for students who may not speak English as a first language or who may learn in different ways. So it's a great way to bring a diversity of learners into the process and into the work that you're doing in your classroom. It's a great way to express thoughts and feelings that are sometimes hard to put into words, especially for students who are just learning about the language of feelings. It's a great way to build empathy and relationships with peers because it's an opportunity for them to talk with each other about what they've made and what they meant by it and what they were hoping to say. There's problem solving inherent in the creative process. What decisions am I going to make? How am I going to go about creating something that expresses what I have in my mind? It's also a great way to enrich other content that you're learning in your classroom, and you'll see examples of projects that have tried to do that throughout this webinar. So, of course, we want to let you know we're always trying to stay connected to the standards. We've pulled the comprehension and collaboration standard for your reference from the English language arts curriculum in the speaking and listening section. A lot of what you would be doing in a creative self-expression activity connects with this standard. Additionally, for those of you who are VAPA teachers, we certainly have connections to the VAPA standards as well. Okay, so to get us started, so as you may have noticed in the title of this webinar, we're talking about both images and specifically photography. And we'll be talking about self-expression activities that don't require the use of photography for those of you who do not have access to cameras in your classroom. And we'll also be sharing some approaches you can use through photography. Most of the approaches can go either way, can use can either be photographic or non-photographic. So there's a lot of flexibility in what we'll be presenting for teachers who have access to different things. Because we'll be referencing throughout the webinar a series of photographic skills videos during the times that we're talking about the possible use of photography, we wanted to invite Brittany Prieto, who's my colleague in the education department and education specialist for youth development at the Getty Museum. And she's in charge of the Unshuttered program, which is the program through which these videos were created. So with that, I'm going to turn over the webinar to her for a little while, and she's going to share with you a little bit of background and some basic information about where to find these videos so that when we're referencing them throughout the webinar, you have an idea of where to look.
Thank you, Rebecca, and I'm so happy to be here with you all today. Again, my name is Brittany Prieto, and along with my colleague Alice Dew, I oversee the youth development programs or teen programs at the Getty Museum. And in the portfolio of those programs, we have offered a program called Unshuttered for quite a few years now, since about 2017. And Unshuttered has had many iterations. It's been an on-site photography intensive. It is a photo sharing app, and it has been a catalyst for nationwide photo sharing open calls. So over the course of these years of creating and documenting the Unshuttered program, we were inspired to create digital resources that are now available for anyone to use. And as Rebecca said, you will see some of these sprinkled throughout today's webinar. And we wanted to just show you a little bit of where you could find those. And like all the resources that we talk about and share today, they will be integrated into the folder of information that you will have access to after this webinar. So I'm just going to share my screen and show you where these videos typically live so that you have that familiarity if you decide to look for them for yourselves. So here we have the Getty Museum YouTube channel, and you can see we have a vast array of videos and resources here. Within this, you will see that there is a featured playlist. You can also get to the featured playlist by clicking the playlist link here at the top. And within the featured playlist, there is the Unshuttered skills. So if you select that link, it will bring you to this page. And you can see here we have, I think it's about 30 different videos that are Unshuttered skill videos. So these are essentially bite-sized videos that are meant to be a catalyst, a kind of source of inspiration, a jumping off point for people to take photographs, but be building their photography skills as they go. So you can see these are just about 20 seconds long, no more than that. And you could think of these as a resource that's maybe something that you have in your back pocket or in the back of your mind as a reference or a resource. They can also very easily be shared within a classroom or with young students. Clicking any one of these videos would bring you to this page where you have the full video available to view. I'm not going to play this now. We'll get to see a few from Rebecca and Darcy as we go along today. But we just wanted to kind of give you some context, lay the foundations, let you know what the source and the reason for these videos are, where they came from and what inspired this work. So I hope these are helpful. Again, we'll make sure to share links with you in the resource folder that you all will have access to after today. And I will be here later to answer questions along with Rebecca and Darcy at the end of the webinar. But at this point, I will hand it back over to Rebecca so she can take us further into the webinar.
Thank you, Brittany. Thank you for that. And the other thing that I'd like to point out about the Unshuttered videos that we'll be looking at later in the webinar are that while they do focus on photography, they talk about general skills of framing an image and approaches to kind of framing the composition to an image or thinking about how you construct an image. So some of them are actually really helpful for other types of art projects as well. So with that, I'd like to get started delving into some of the actual self-expression activities that we'd like to share with you today. And I wanted to let you know that in the process of developing these to share with you, we tried to keep them somewhat unspecific in terms of materials. We wanted to acknowledge we've over the years worked with teachers and recognize that there's a great variety of access to materials, especially within the mainstream classroom as opposed to the VAPA classroom. And so we wanted to make sure that we had lots of ideas for you, especially if your materials are limited to markers or pencils and paper. But we also hope to show you ways that you could do more complicated, or not complicated, but slightly more materials heavy work as well. So our focus is less on the materiality of the activities and more on the concept that drives them, with the space and flexibility for you to customize them based on what is available to you in your classroom. So we are focusing today on 4 main themes. One is self-expression in the form of telling about yourself, so communicating something about your identity. And there's two approaches that we'll be talking about. One is self-portraits, and we have lots of ideas about specific strategies you can use for self-portraiture. And another is to focus on places that are special to the student, kind of capturing a place that the student finds important to them. We're also focusing on the idea of sharing something that you believe in or sharing your opinion about something, expressing your feelings and mood, and also telling a story about something in your life, whether it's someone in your community or someone in your family or your class even, as well as, and you can certainly take these ideas and stretch them to tell a story about other things in students' lives as well. And when we were looking at sample works of art from students as we were putting together this webinar, one work that didn't get included, but which was very compelling, was a student's work about telling a story about their trip to the library. So even things like that, telling a story about something that they did recently, is another way to express what's important to them. So just very briefly, some tips that we like to remind teachers of is really to focus on the process over the product. There's often a drive with assessment rubrics to measure the quality of the project in terms of how well it depicts a particular thing. Is it accurate to how that thing really looks, what that thing really looks like? I remember looking at an image of a shark that was floating above the water and getting into a conversation with teachers about, well, sharks are under the water, they're not over the water, so is that good? So really focusing more on the creative process and how well the image follows the prompt or answers the prompt in expressing something about the student, rather than in how realistic it may be. It's also really helpful for students to focus your commentary on asking questions that get at what their thinking is in developing the creative work that they're working on, rather than telling them what's good or not so good, giving them an idea, helping them to think about it for themselves. And also talking about something that didn't go the way that the student had wanted to, like maybe they accidentally made a mark where they didn't intend it to, and thinking about how that can be turned into a happy accident in the creative process as well. And then certainly within the limits of what you can manage within a classroom setting, trying to offer some choices for students is always helpful in helping students to get started, especially when students, less so I think with the younger students, but as students get older and start to have feelings like, oh, I can't draw, that helps to work around some of those challenges by offering choices. So we are focusing in the examples that we're sharing with you today, we're focusing on a combination of prompts and activities. So the prompts are kind of the big ideas that inspire this self-expression process. So they're discussion questions, and they're looking at examples from other artists. And those artists might be artists in museums or contemporary artists, or they may be other works by other students. And then the activities focus on ways that you might carry out that prompt. So it's much more about the process of helping students to express their ideas in a certain area, and identifying what kinds of approaches you might use and what types of mediums or materials might be helpful. But we do want to hit home that paper and pencil is great too. And we have several great examples to show you that, that were made just using those types of materials. Okay, so now I'd like to go ahead and jump into our first series of approaches to self-expression, focusing on self-portraiture. I'm going to invite my colleague, Darcy Beeman-Black, who's the Associate Education Specialist for Teacher Programs at the Getty Education Department, to go through this with you today.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. So as Rebecca said, we're going to go through a number of ideas for activities that you can do with your students. The first one that I am going to share is the Make a Self-Portrait activity. So self-portraits offer the opportunity for students to self-reflect, understand themselves, and can help us and the student learn more about their values, interests, and beliefs. And I'm going to go through a few steps that you can do to make this activity as simple as you want it to be, or you offer some extensions so you can meet the needs of your students. So first, I want to call out the idea that sharing work of peers is a way to embolden students to think about themselves as artists. So sometimes making art can feel intimidating and overwhelming, and we believe that sharing the work of other young artists that are the same age or in the same peer group can show students that they are able to make art without the pressure of emulating what they think of when they think of like a professional artist. So both Rebecca and I will share art from students throughout the presentation, and we encourage you to think about this concept as you go forward in this work with your students. Okay, so for the first step in the self-portrait activity, the prompt that Rebecca talked about, we think it's a good idea to start by looking at self-portraits made by other artists. So you could perhaps try you could also try some of the reading, discussing, and researching activities from previous webinars in the series. But I have included a few discussion questions here to jump right in. So for example, you might have a discussion about what a self-portrait is with your class. The work we see here is a photograph by a young artist. You could have a rich discussion with your students about what makes this a self-portrait. So what are the elements included? We see there have been some specific choices made about how the color of the background matches the color of the text on this young girl's shirt. The facial expression captured might say something. And then of course, the position of the body communicates something. So you could talk with your students about how these choices communicate specific things about this person. And then another example you could share is this self-portrait that's a painting by Charles Antoine Coypel. And there are some key elements here that tell us about who this artist is. For example, the clothing he is wearing is the official clothing of the Academy of France. You may or may not know that, but it is in the description of the artwork. And he worked at this academy. There is artwork in front of him, and he holds a portfolio that looks like it has sketches. He also holds his arm out as if, he's welcoming you to the scene, or maybe he's presenting himself. It also seems like maybe he's a little proud. Another example is this self-portrait by Francesco Paolo Michetti. This one maybe tells us about the artist's style with the way that the pastels are used to create this textural background. This one has more of like a sketch-like feel and may evoke feelings of the artists rather than, outright giving us objects to pull from, though that monocle that he's wearing definitely gives me some ideas about maybe who this person is and what type of person they are. So the next step after you've, shared a number of examples of self-portraits with your students, you could then move on to step 2. And this is where you can start digging into what they might include in a self-portrait. So the photograph I have shown here is by Hippolyte Bayard. Bayard did a series of self-portraits that included an elaborate collection of objects that he loved. He had a really big passion for plants, and he came from a long line of family of gardeners in his family. He planned the whole scene and included, what he was going to wear, his hat, and how things were placed in the photograph. So you could have your students create a list of what they might include, much like Bayard did in this self-portrait. For step 3, it's time to choose a self-portrait strategy. And what I mean by that is really what medium, materials, and processes are you going to use in your classroom? So you may have some constraints, or you may want to pick a strategy that works best for your students, or the accessibility of materials, as some of you shared in the poll earlier. So I'm going to share a few ideas of what you might do. This list includes a plethora of materials and processes that you could try depending on your situation. So the first strategy is to keep it simple. So we do this a lot at the museum since we are unable to use a lot of messy materials in the galleries. And I suspect some of you may have the same feeling about things getting messy. So simple drawing materials and paper can still be a great way for students to express themselves through portraiture. You can also cut out shapes like heads or busts or a hand and have students fill those out with imagery that expresses who they are. Here is an example of a self-portrait drawing by a young student who really likes sports, and he drew himself wearing a jersey shirt. And I see there's some team spirit written on that shirt. Even with simple materials like pencil and paper, we still get a lot of information about who the student is and what they want to share with us. Another idea is to use either a template of a hand, or you could have a student trace their hand, and on each finger, they would choose a word or phrase that says something about them and put on each finger. And then they would draw something to elaborate on that word. This student loves dinosaurs and eating fruit. And you can see here that she had help writing the words, but then she drew the dinosaur and what looks like maybe strawberries or fruit. My personal favorite on this piece are the hearts on the pinky. I love to love, and the hearts just sort of fall down the side of the hand. And I think that was a really interesting choice by this young artist. So this is also definitely a great approach for younger students. The next strategy is to use an assortment of materials to define the details they want to share about themselves. Students can cut basic shapes out of construction paper and glue them down, and then add details using fabric, yarn, buttons, or any other materials you can find. So this strategy is adding a few more materials like glue or found objects, or scissors. So those are things to keep in mind if you decide to use this one. And then this strategy is using photography skills to make self-portraits. So if you have access to a camera, you could have students work individually or in pairs or in small groups to capture themselves in a number of ways. Close-up portraits could be a fun place to start. And here are a few short videos from the YouTube page that Brittany shared earlier. And you could share these directly with your students to get them started. So I'm going to play them for you now. So that, like Brittany mentioned earlier, those are really short and they're usually like like 2 to 3 steps. And so it's just a good place to start. And then here's another one that you might like, and you can find all of these on that YouTube page. So once you would share those, there could be, like some time for play. And then you could, they could choose the best one that they came up with. All right, so you can also do self-portraits with an untraditional point of view. So here's an example from a student using dramatic angles to share his love of basketball. I imagine there was a lot of planning involved to get this particular point of view. And I think that the choice to capture the feet that run plays during a game was probably planned as well. And then we also have some skill videos to support this approach. So I'm going to play those really quickly for you also. And I'm turning them down so that you don't get your eardrums blown out. And then this next one would be a good option too. All right, so there are a ton of videos like that to choose from, but I thought these were pretty good places to start. So with that, I'm actually going to pass it back over to Rebecca, who's going to share a couple more.
Thanks, Darcy. Okay, so now we'll be looking at another approach or another prompt for self-expression, which is to invite students to think about a special place for them. And you can keep it as open as you like. You can even have it include imaginary places in your process. So here's an example of a student work of art. This was made by one of the students in the Unshuttered program, in fact, who had the opportunity to spend a lot of time at the Getty and build his photography skills. And so this was a special place that he captured with this expansive point of view using his camera. So to get us started, one approach, of course, is to look at examples made by other artists. And as Darcy has brought up, we love including other students in that conversation. And to talk about what kind of place did the artist capture? So what sorts of places might constitute a special place? Could they be as small as your closet or as large as a country? And what might be special about a place? So to talk about, well, what makes a place special? Is it because of something that something sensory, like something about the smell or the feeling of being there? Or is it because of the people who are in that place? Or is it because of something that happened in that place? So really delving into what it is that makes places special in the first place. So here's another example in a painting by Vincent van Gogh that he made when he was suffering from mental illness and had checked himself into an asylum in Saint-Rémy, France. And these irises that he painted were in the garden outside of the quarters where he was staying, which were somewhat limited. And so this place became a special place for him, a place of sanctuary and peace and calm. So you could look at this with your students and talk about what about this place might have been attractive or appealing or special for Vincent van Gogh. So then you can talk about, well, what kinds of places might be special to you specifically, and to work with students to identify what kind of place they would like to share. What about it makes it special? Is it somewhere that you've gone to? Is it somewhere in your imagination? Is it somewhere that you go all the time, or just every now and then, or maybe only once in your life? What more about it? Is it indoors or is it outdoors? What does it feel like to be there? What kinds of things do you see there? Is it bright? Is it dark? And really getting into what the qualities are about the place that they're thinking of. Here's an example made by a student of a special place for him. And to me, it looks somewhat imaginary, but what I see is this bright blue sky and these bright purple flowers. And so when I read it, I think, okay, it was the color and the brightness that had a mood that captured this student. Here's another example from another student who is clearly thinking about home and places that you're comfortable, places that might be a place of peace or familiarity. And then thinking about what approach you might use for creation. Certainly, we looked at painting, we looked at collage. Some of the videos that Darcy just shared are also really helpful in thinking about capturing a special place. For example, thinking about the point of view that you depict it from in photography, or for example. And also, of course, we don't want to give up pencil and paper drawing or markers and paper drawing. This is also a great one where you can get very creative, even three-dimensional, and capturing things about the feeling of the place through the three-dimensionality and the choices of colors that are used, or the general feeling of whatever object they made. It could be that there's a tree that they would sculpt that would have been a special place for them, that where that tree stood. Okay, so the other approach that I wanted to share with you is sharing opinions or beliefs. And that could be as simple as sharing, students sharing what their favorite food is or what their favorite color is, but it can also build on conversations that you're having in your classroom. For example, when you're engaging with the social studies curriculum, and you're thinking about people in your community and things about how your community works, who are the people in your community that help it to thrive. And I'm going to share with you some discussion questions and examples that were made by students. So here's an example where in the classroom, there was some discussion about rights, equal rights, and discussion of, I think this lesson happened somewhere around the time of Martin Luther King Day. And there was a discussion of, well, what does it mean to have equal rights? What did it mean when people didn't have equal rights? And this student was focusing on, I think that's Jackie Robinson, focusing on inequalities in early baseball teams. And this looks like a somewhat fancy project, but it's really actually just a toilet paper roll. It's a very COVID type of a project, with a piece of paper slotted into the toilet paper roll so that it can stand up. So some of the questions you might discuss with students, it could be very specific to something you're covering in your classroom, or it could be broader, like what's something that's important to you? Or how would you like to help make the world a better place? Or here's an example about messaging. What message would you like to share? Here, one example, the one on the left, is about recycling. And this student who was thinking a lot about the environment and what does it mean to recycle and how can I contribute to helping the environment, and was thinking about helping the environment through recycling. Here's another example where the focus was on human rights and fairness and freedom. And this one, similar to the project that Darcy shared as a self-portrait activity, used a cutout of a hand as the frame for sharing these ideas. Here's an example. So the other thing you can do is look at examples of other artists who have made works that had social messaging in them. This is a photograph in the Getty's collection made by photographer Leonard Freed. And Leonard Freed was born in New York, and one of the areas where he was really interested in documenting history was in the civil rights movement. And I'll read a quote from Leonard Freed himself because I think it captures a lot of what we're talking about today. He once said, "Ultimately, photography is about who you are. It's the seeking of truth in relation to yourself." So even for Leonard Freed, when he was capturing other truths in the world around him, they became part of his truth as he engaged with those experiences of his subjects. So you could pull up this image and use some of the how to read an image and how to discuss an image or talk about an image approaches that we've talked about in our prior webinars to look at who's in the picture, what's going on in the picture, why was that man holding up that newspaper for the photographer to capture, what did the photographer want to capture in this image, and how did he go about sharing that message. But one of the things that's I find interesting about this particular photograph is the amount of text in the photograph, and the fact that there's this very potent social message in the foreground, and then text about a soda fountain in the background. So it's juxtaposing different forces within society that are contributing to the very lack of justice that the man is trying to communicate about by holding up the newspaper. So, and similarly, as with the other projects, you can go ahead and think about what making strategy works for your classroom. Signboards is something that is an approach that's very specific to this self-expression activity, either a singular large piece of paper or something like the example with the toilet paper roll that shows somebody holding up a signboard. Certainly photographs, drawings, and all the other things that we're talking about today work really well too. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna transfer the floor over to Darcy again to share the last few activities that we'd like to cover during the webinar.
All right, so this next prompt and activity is about using color and light to share your mood. So I think this is a good activity to touch on the social emotional side of self-expression. Learning to communicate your mood visually can be a good way to work through feelings and understand others. So again, for step one, we can look at art of others to get started. Here's an example of student work that really captures a feeling. So you could facilitate a discussion about what mood this photograph communicates and why. You could also have students attach words to the colors in this photograph or describe the colors verbally that they see in this place. How would your students describe the light? That might be a good exercise to get started. And then what do you think it would feel like to be in this place? How do you think this person feels based on how they're sitting, what they're looking at, what their facial expression is, what they're wearing? You could really dissect this image around what the mood is. And then I have another example by artist Edvard Munch. This is an oil painting on canvas, and the use of blue and purple may spark some ideas about mood with your students. So this one is a good one to imagine you are inside, that to imagine you are inside of, and how you would feel perhaps sitting on this little ledge in the foreground. Maybe students could imagine how they would be positioned if they were in this space. You know, how would they sit? How would they stand? You know, why would they do that? What sort of, what mood would that position portray? And then step 2 involves discussing mood and how to portray it with words, color, and light. So students could choose the mood they want to portray and then answer these questions to work through what they will create. So what do we mean by mood? How can your art communicate what you're feeling? Thinking about these works of art that we've already seen, you know, how can you transfer that same way or approach to your own work? And then what words can you use to describe your mood? What colors are you choosing and why? And then how can you use light in your work of art? So I have a skills video that touches on light that I'm going to play for you quickly. Sorry about that. So that video just really quickly touched on how different times of day exhibit different types of light. So, you know, it's not practical for your younger students possibly to, you know, choose a time of day to take a photo, but communicating how different times of day show a different mood might give your students some ideas in their projects that maybe are not photography related. So that's why I wanted to share that one. And then the next one could be a really fun one for students to play around with. So if you have a flashlight available for your students, I think this one would be really fun. But I'm going to just play it and then we'll talk about it. So I really felt like that one would be a good one to just jump into playing with light. Your students could work in groups and play around with different ideas. One cool thing about digital photography is that there's a lot of room to take a lot of photos, and then you could have your students choose the best one after a good play session, and they could choose the one that communicates what mood they're trying to share. So I thought that one would be a really good one for younger students too. All right, so step 4 is to choose your approach for creation. So maybe photography isn't the best choice, but you can still use other materials like drawing, collage, painting, and sculpture. So consider the materials that work best for your student's skill level. You may decide to stretch them a bit. They might surprise you. And here's a few examples of using color to express mood with different approaches. So on the left, there we see this, this very young student used green to express moods. I personally just adore this figure on the top left that has this very specific expression. I think that it has a very green expression. And so I really think that this is using mood to communicate, using visually communicating mood. And then we saw this other photograph earlier that uses color to portray a message. Okay, so the next prompt is for self-expression is tell a story. So for this example, I'm going to focus on telling a story about someone in your community as a way to express yourself with art. So first, to stay on par with our pattern, I have some examples from other artists. So this one is of The Newsboy by Lewis Hine, and it captures a lot of details about this young person working at the time. So you could have a conversation about who this person is and what clues are there to support their claims. I love this work because I could have put it or I could have filed it under the self-portrait section as well. So some of you may notice that the artist has included himself at the bottom as a shadow in this one. And I just think that this image, you've seen it in a lot of our past webinars, and it's because it really works for a lot of things. And then another example is the photograph of the fireman, which some of you might be familiar with. This particular fireman is holding a brass instrument that he would have used as a siren. So you could have a whole conversation with your students about, firemen today versus firemen from 120 years ago. And then I also included this drawing by Vincent van Gogh of a postman. So you can see if students are able to guess what this is, or, talk about their experiences with postal workers today. I know I've seen videos online of students who get really excited when like the trash man comes, and that might be a good one too. All right, and then we have the Nuestra Señora de las Iguanas, and she was a woman who sold iguanas at a market in Mexico, and this may seem very unique, or it could be very familiar to some students, but you could have a whole conversation about different people in the community that maybe other students haven't heard of before, or that are unique to their location or their backgrounds, and they could share those with each other. And then the next step is to brainstorm. So students can think about members of the community that are important to them and then select one to depict. They can list words that could be used to describe that person and consider what details would help someone else know who that person is if they were looking at an image of them. And then step 3 is to choose an approach for students to use. So I have some ideas here. We've talked about drawing and painting, but students could also make a comic strip detailing a day in the life of the person. I'm going to dig a little deeper into the next 2, which is curating a set of images and using photography skills. So another way to use self-expression to tell stories is through curation. I'm sure at the museum, we definitely see collecting images to tell a story as an art form, and your students can do this too. So here's an example of me putting images together that tell the story of a fireman from the early 1900s. You could have students work in groups or individually for this project. It could also be entirely digital, or if you have the means, you could print the images out and present them in a class, like in a gallery style setting, or something like that. And then you could also have students do what Lewis Hine did with the Newsboy and capture a person in their community using photography. So here's a student image capturing a fruit cart vendor from their neighborhood. And I have a skills video that you could share with students for this one too. And I'll make sure it's turned down before I play it this time. All right, and so finally, I just shared ways to tell a story about someone in your community, but you could also tell stories about someone in your family or in your class. So here are a few examples of students telling stories about their family. This painting on the left depicts the wedding day of the student's parents. And then the drawing on the right depicts a person playing t-ball and their family is cheering them on. And then here's an example of a student telling a story about her math class using pen and paper. And judging by the huge smile on the person's face in the drawing, I'm gathering that this is a fun place to be. There are also details about the setup and the position of the tables that the student really thought about to share the story of her math class. Okay, so that concludes the presentation, and we can now get into questions that you may have for us.
Great. Thanks, Darcy. So I'd also like to invite Brittany back to the screen. And so we have a few minutes to go ahead and answer any questions you may have. I am checking the Q&A to see what we have today. And it looks like we have a question. Maybe we can start with Darcy. Send this question to Darcy. I'll read it aloud. My second graders have Chromebooks. They can use the camera and take photos. What do you suggest for creativity? Take the Chromebooks outside, change the background, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's creativity in like the most simple things. So you've named a couple of really good ones. There are some skills videos, and Brittany may know of a couple more than me, that are things like composition, which is, really thinking about what is in that photograph and how it is positioned within the frame. Brittany, do you know of another one that might be just simple and?
Yeah, well, your instinct to think about going outdoors or staying in, I think, is a great one as well, because that can open up some really great conversations about light. And there are skill videos about natural light, and then about the lighting within a space that you can utilize and kind of manipulate the way you want it, and what kind of effect that can have on the ultimate image. So I think that plays into it as well. I would also probably say that if there's already a precedent for using the camera and doing the photographs in your classroom, like absolutely get outside and use them. If that would be a new element that students may find more comfort in doing that exercise in a familiar space, maybe starting in their classroom, and as they get more confident in using the camera, switching up your location and moving outside could be the next really exciting step for them, if you think about it in sequence.
I think the other suggestion I would bring into the conversation is to think about what other things they bring into the photograph, thinking about the notion of props and what props can communicate. So there was that example of extreme close-up, a kind of a non-traditional point of view self-portrait in which a student took a picture of their feet along with a basketball. So thinking about how the combination of shoes and basketball tell a story. I'm so thinking about what objects can be integrated to help tell that story, or those examples of self-portraiture where there were works of art, where there was an artist with a work of art that he had created in the image itself. So yes, but I think we've covered a lot of different approaches you can have. Let's see, we have one more question and then we'll wrap up. So the question is, when you work with recyclable products, do the students bring the materials from home? So actually, that's more a question I would throw out to the teachers who are here today in the chat. I've heard about both approaches being done. And as a parent, I've also experienced being asked to bring in things, but also experienced the teacher collecting them on their own. So my hunch is that it probably depends on the dynamic that you have in your particular community, in your particular school, and your particular class. but certainly I welcome teachers to put their comments and suggestions about that in the chat right now too. Okay, well, so it's 4:30, so I'd like to go ahead and wrap up. I'm going to go ahead and share our final slide. Thank you, Brittany, so much, and Darcy as well, for presenting today and for helping to answer some of our questions. This is the last of our webinar series for this academic year. We'll be offering another version of this same webinar geared for grades 6 through 12 teachers. So if you're a teacher that works across grade areas, feel free to join us for that as well. That one is on April 27th. Additionally, we are working hard to put together a slate of programs for teachers for next academic year. So please don't hesitate to join our mailing list and follow our website. And we will be announcing as we get closer to the fall what's coming up for next year. We hope that we will have the opportunity to virtually or see some of you who've been joining us this year in the webinars next fall as well. And last but not least, I'd like to thank you all for joining us and wish you all the best in the remainder of your school year and a great evening this evening as well. Have a great day, and we look forward to having the opportunity to see you all again.